On March 6, 1988, bystanders and drivers were shocked to see university students running and yelling across sidewalks and streets, all coming from a usually quiet and calm university in Washington, D.C. However, when reporters surrounded the scene, students with handmade signs, deaf students of Gallaudet University, were no longer staying quiet. They walked with purpose, some signing determined or excitedly in ASL, and held bold-lettered signs above their heads, which spelled out Deaf President Now. These protests, seemingly sudden and lasting over a week, were actually the result of decades of unfounded discrimination against deaf and hard-of-hearing individuals. In fact, the Deaf President Now protests sparked the beginning of a national deaf civil rights movement that brought public attention to the hard-of-hearing and deaf's ability to lead. And it inspired both events celebrating deaf talent and encouraged the integration of the deaf into a previously hearing-dominated society. In the 1800s, it was difficult and almost impossible for deaf people to find work or even fit in society, mostly due to a lack of communication and a belief that a deaf individual was less of a person than a hearing one because of their assumed unshakable unintelligence. This discriminatory thinking came to be known as autism, and was easy to find in school deans, employers, or even anyone who may have interacted with the deaf. Many educators would later argue that autism was also spread by a type of teaching called pure oralism, which completely eradicates sign language from the teaching of deaf students and has them learn to talk and read lips, a method many argued could destroy deaf sign language culture. In 1856, the year just before Gallaudet University was founded, it was recorded that deaf teachers made up only 40% of the workforce in these schools, and were rarely ever allowed to teach higher grades because of the discrimination towards their supposed disability. A mostly oralist and hearing-driven education conference in Milan, Italy, 1880, was later a major catalyst that caused many deaf educators to lose their jobs and be removed from schools, and therefore also as deaf role models across the world. In this way, a barrier of discrimination, ignorance, and forced inequality was placed between the deaf and hearing communities that over the decades was either accepted out of reluctant tolerance or out of the failure of the goals of small protests in human rights laws.
Students here behind me have been demonstrating and waiting all day outside the gates of Gallaudet University, while inside the Board of Trustees have been meeting, trying to pick a new president. Now, if students get their way, the university is going to have its first deaf president in 124 years.
In the beginning of March 1988, the board had to reach a decision of a new president for Gallaudet University, the future leader of the most influential deaf school in America. They narrowed it down to 3 finalists, 2 of whom were deaf. In the weeks leading up to the board's decision, the students began to march across campus to support the choice of a deaf president, a deaf role model for the students and deaf community, and proof of how strong, intelligent, and skilled the deaf person could be.
And he, as the president, will prove the world that he could take this position, and that will influence the world that we deaf could be equal to him and equal to our peers all over the world.
But it wouldn't come to pass. The Board of Trustees ultimately chose the only hearing finalist, a woman named Elizabeth Zinser, who had never learned sign language and who had little experience with the deaf community, like many members of the board itself. The board announced the decision at the Mayflower Hotel, which is where the students went to demand answers.
Tonight, the board president told students they picked Zinser because she had the best qualifications.
However, the board and Jane Spillman, the board chair, would not listen to the students or their demands. It was the ultimate insult for the students.
He's a slap in our face. I might not look angry, but I am so damn angry that this makes me sick.
At this meeting, Jane Spillman even allegedly said, "Deaf people are not ready to function in a hearing world." Deaf people were still often barred from many opportunities because of their deafness, and the perception of the deaf being uneducated individuals still persisted in many circles. And now a hearing-controlled committee in an institution famed for deaf opportunity had placed a barrier in front of the deaf yet again. The students had had enough.
A question before you go. Do the students have any chance at all of turning the decision around?
According to the students, yes. The next day, the students blocked off the entrance of the school and made 4 demands: that Zinsser step down and that a new deaf president be chosen, that Spillman, the board chair, would resign, 51% deaf majority on the Board of Trustees, and no deaf punishment for any of the protesters. Spillman refused to listen to the students' demands, so the students of Gallaudet University made a stand by spontaneously marching to the U.S. Capitol building. And what seemed to be a sudden outburst to outsiders was actually a spontaneous but calculated series of protests over the next week. The protesters soon gained a very crucial part of their protest: media attention.
For the deaf.
President.
Hearing and deaf families and people in Washington, D.C., and all over the nation were able to watch and follow along with the protests, and the testament of the students for a deaf leader, a perspective rare and nearly non-existent for most people. As the 4th day of protests came and went, Elizabeth Zinsser arrived in Washington, D.C. 3 months before she was supposed to start her presidency. She believed that her appearance would help diffuse protests. Protests continued, and students refused to compromise with her and the board, while others actually blockaded the school. I. King Jordan, one of the leading deaf finalists, met with Zinsser and announced that he supported her presidency, which shocked some protesters. However, the faculty of the school held their own meeting on the day of her arrival and nearly unanimously agreed that they stood behind the students in their fight for deaf leadership. By the next day, students from other schools for the deaf came to show their support, and money from all sorts of businesses in D.C. and across America came pouring in. I. King Jordan soon walked on stage and took back his support of Elizabeth Zinsser, stating that he did so originally to be reasonable and fair, but he was actually angered by the board's lack of confidence and supported all of the students' demands. That night, Elizabeth Zinsser made a decision and announced to Gallaudet students and supporters that she was stepping down from her presidency. Students were simply ecstatic. Students didn't stop there and had eyes on winning the fight of getting deaf leadership, however, and marched for their new victory with the allies of the protest behind them. By the 7th day of the protest, Jane Spillman resigned and a new deaf board chair was chosen. More importantly, I. King Jordan was chosen as the first deaf president of Gallaudet University, and the protest became the symbol of deaf power, pride, and leadership everywhere. Deaf President Now had significant influence that impacted the lives of both deaf communities across the world and on people with disabilities. One of the powerful events created after the Deaf President Now movement were the Deaf Way conventions. Deaf Way was a celebration of deaf artists, theater, ideas, and culture from all around the world, right on Gallaudet campus. Deaf Way 2 was created 13 years later. Together, they created a sense of international community among all the diverse ethnicities and nationalities of the deaf in their arts. Many influential people, such as senators, reverends, and even Vice President George W. Bush, contacted Gallaudet University before and during the protests in support of the choice of a deaf president. Only 1 month after the protests, the Americans with Disabilities Act was introduced in the Senate. This law would dictate very firmly that it is prohibited to deny anyone the chance to get and receive opportunities and work because of their disability, or to create a barrier to stop them. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act officially became law and became one of the few essential laws of its kind where those with disabilities are protected in such a way. Another law enacted shortly after the Deaf President Now movement was the Television Decoder Circuitry Act of 1990. It was revolutionary in the way it required closed captioning technology in nearly every TV, technology that was unheard of at the time and made all television accessible to the deaf. After decades of discrimination against the deaf in the workplace, as students, and as teachers, students empowered by their own confidence in deaf power and intelligence started a protest to have fair representation and brought attention to the barrier in equality and opportunity between the hearing and the deaf. The perception of the deaf in the public eye changed for the better after intelligent deaf students made a stand for their own rights and future, and civil rights laws were created very quickly after the movement that supported the hard of hearing and individuals with disabilities. Deaf leaders and role models started appearing more and more as other schools took Gallaudet University's example. In this way, the imposed barrier of inequality, opportunity, discrimination, and perception between the deaf community and the hearing was broken.